My Lords, I thank Lord Snape, the noble Lord Snape, for securing this important debate, and he gave us a splendid knockabout speech to start with, full of horror stories, and these horror stories have been added to failures, inconveniences, cancellations, and so forth in the course of our debate. But I would like to take the word strategy seriously, and I would say that many of these comments, these examples that have been deduced today, are not really pertinent to the question of strategy. They are what I would rather think of as tactical failings. And you can have a large number of tactical failings without meaning you haven't got, it doesn't necessarily mean you haven't got a good strategy nonetheless. Now, that said, I don't think the government has much of a strategy for transport, but I do think the two are worth distinguishing. I'd like to use the few minutes available to me to set out what I think are some of the principles that ought to underlie a transport strategy for this country, indeed for the United Kingdom. The first is we need to think the right way. We need to think teleologically about transport. The purpose of transport is transport. It is moving people and goods. That movement brings benefits. Of course it does. It brings economic and social benefits. But these are not inherently the purpose of transport. They are beneficial consequences. Just as transport brings pollution, pollution is not the purpose of transport. It is simply a negative, an unwelcome consequence. We need to distinguish between the purpose of what we're doing and the consequences. That would be my first point. The second point is that nor is it the purpose of transport to meet non-transport policy objectives. For example, net zero. I think it's quite interesting, incidentally, as an aside, that I'm probably the first person in this debate to use the words net zero. And I don't use them in a very positive way, but I just give it as an example. Extraneous policy objectives are constraints on how you deliver your transport policy. They tell you how you should be doing it rather than why you should be doing it. And that's also a necessary clearing of the mind if we are to think about these things properly. Now, the next point I'd want to make, and it might seem obvious, but it has huge consequences, is public transport works best where you have passengers, where you have a concentration of passengers. And that means it works well, largely speaking, in cities and larger towns. That is, having that density of population is a necessary condition for sustainable public transport. Now, it is, of course, possible that transport services can create density in the way that the Metropolitan Railway created Metroland, but our anti-development planning policies nowadays make that a thing, sadly, of the past. Now, the fourth point is that as a consequence of that, we have to be realistic about what we are ever going to be able to offer rural areas in terms of public transport services. The idea that rural areas are going to have transport services that are akin to what is on offer in London is simply unrealistic. It is to hold out a pledge which can never be met. But it does emphasise that, especially in rural areas, there is always going to be a very important role for the private motor car, and indeed for cheap private motor cars. So the whole question of electric vehicles and how far we can expect them to spread, especially in rural areas, seems to me to be determined by their cost. And at the moment, they are far too expensive. But if we want cheap ones, we're going to have to pay to import them all from China. That's basically the dilemma we're facing on that. So we need to be realistic about that. The next point, and this might be controversial, is that public transport is expensive to run, especially rail. It costs a great deal of money, and it's not simply because of the monopoly supply of labour and the way in which the trades unions have been able to extract enormous salaries, especially for drivers, as a result of that. So it's very expensive to run, and only the fare payer or the taxpayer can actually pay for it. The money has to come from one of those two sources, and it's a profoundly political decision how that expense is going to be allocated. My suggestion, unpopular though it may be, is that any national strategy should be directed at maximising fare income. This does not mean high fares for everyone, because transport is a paradigm case of where marginal pricing adds to income. Railway operators have understood this since the railway started in the 19th century. The fact is it costs the same to run the train, whether it has more or less the same, whether it has passengers on it or not. And so even £1 from that last marginal passenger actually adds to income. Now, airlines completely understand this and set their prices and vary their prices from day to day on that basis in order to maximise revenue, not by having high fares for everyone, but for having high fares for some and lower fares for others. And we should perhaps learn from that. I would like to say, I'm coming to a conclusion, a lot about technology, as my noble friend Lord Holmes of Richmond. That would be another speech. There is a great deal to say on that, but I will briefly finally say something about the nationalisation of rail as announced today. I am not, despite what you might think, a mad privatiser of every utility. In fact, I was Deputy Chairman of Transport for London, so I can hardly believe entirely in privately running things. But the announcement today will, of course, make no difference whatsoever. Nearly everything you can pick up and touch in the railways is nationalised already, except the trains. If you take over the train operating companies, which are already puppets of the Department for Transport, you will simply have the same people doing the same job. So nothing very much is going to change on that, but you will run out of capital at some point to invest, because that is the great advantage of privatisation.